So welcome to part two of my attempt to answer the question, why would you leave a studio job? If you haven't seen the first video, that's okay. The plot of this one kind of stands on its own, but if you're interested in seeing the first one, I'll put a link or a card or whatever it is up here so you can check that out first. So to recap what's going to go on here, I'm addressing specific topics and talking about the good and the bad as they relate to being a freelancer or being in a studio job, because there's often a lot of gray area, and what's good or bad is really, well, it's sometimes dependent on you as a person and what you like, basically. Sounds obvious, but we'll dive into a few ideas here. Let's jump in. Coworkers. Now, whether or not this is a bad thing or a good thing depends entirely on you as a person. Like I was just saying, are you an extrovert or an introvert? Are you a new artist or a veteran? Are you a people person or someone who likes working in isolation? Everybody's different, and it's hard to give an answer on this one, whether this is positive or negative. For me personally, I love working in isolation. I thrive when I'm by myself and I can just focus on work. I'm not distracted by people talking, noises in the hallway, smells from the kitchen, phones ringing, and all the other distractions that come with being in an office with other people. For other people, that's the definition of hell. They need other people around, and they start to get stir crazy. They want to interact with their fellow humans and bounce ideas off of them, or just make small talk right down in the kitchen or the coffee maker or whatever. I don't. You might. Good luck. One thing I have noticed is that the longer I freelance, the worse my social skills become. I generally will interact with my wife and my dog on a daily basis, and that's about it. Well, and maybe the room when I'm talking out loud to myself. My dog doesn't really care what words I use, as long as I'm not saying them in an angry voice. And when you've been married for a while, you get into a communication cadence with your spouse that doesn't necessarily reflect how you talk to other people. You have inside jokes, specific phrases, trigger words. You almost develop a second language with them, which is not necessarily useful when it comes to interacting with somebody else. So when I do find myself communicating with the outside world, I find that my filters have broken down somewhat. I've become more blunt, more direct, which can be interpreted as rude or aggressive, when you're to someone who's not used to dealing with you. So it's something to watch out for and be mindful of, because it's a small industry, and the way you interact with people today can affect your employment opportunities in the future. So just be aware. So advancements and promotions. As a freelancer, these don't exist for you anymore. You're outside the corporate bubble, which means you're outside of the hierarchy. Nobody's going to give you a new title or add senior to your current job title when you cross a certain number of years of experience, or whatever else goes on that helps to drive people forward in their careers within studios. I don't have too much else to say on this topic, but somebody asked, so I'm covering it. Basically, if titles and advancements and climbing the ladder are important to you, then being a freelancer, it's probably not going to work, because as I said at the beginning, these don't exist for you anymore. So if that's part of what drives you, it's part of your psyche, your makeup, stay with the studio job. So this is a large difference, and it's something that sort of crept up on me when I started freelancing and had been doing it for a while. This kind of occurred to me. So when you're working at a studio job, you're inside the machine. You're subject to all the meetings, the marketing plans, the interviews happening around the office, the trade show prep, and all of that hype happening. And you get excited, right? And you get invested in the game you're working on, and that can become a very significant driving force. Now, as a freelancer, that sort of goes away. Don't get me wrong. I care about the games I work on, and I always put my best foot forward on them. But once that contract is up, I just move on, right? It's more of that mercenary type thing. I'm sort of interested in how the game does after release, but I'm not completely tied up in it. It's not like, if it doesn't do well, then I don't have a job next month and that kind of thing. It's more of from a casual observer sort of perspective. Looking back on it now that I've been on and off a few titles, large and small, I think it's just an extension of what the freelancer is. I'm there to solve a problem, and I move on. I don't necessarily rearrange my life or tie my future happiness to how that game performs. My job is done. I'm out. I think it has to do with the fact that I'm just doing art. I'm not involved in design or marketing or anything else. So whether the game is fun or not, whether it sells well or not, whether it has a good Metacritic score or not, these are things that I don't really control. And these are also things that don't really affect my life. Well, it affects my life sort of, but not in the same way that it affects someone who works within that studio day in and day out. So that's just something to be aware of, and an interesting mental shift that I noticed over time. So we'll cover this more in depth in a future video, but one of the departments you're really going to start to miss when you start freelancing is the IT department. Basically, you are the IT department now. So you're responsible for everything from hardware upgrading and maintenance to software upgrades to software licenses to data protection. So to touch on this briefly, what you have to keep in mind is that you're working with client data. Client data needs to be respected. It's the lifeblood of your business. It's what you're producing. So that data needs to be backed up and it needs to be stored redundantly. You need to be able to answer the question, what happens if my computer dies right now? What's your plan for getting back up and running? How long will it take? Because your client's deadline is not changing because your hard drive died or because your power supply exploded. That deadline is the same. So the faster you can get up and running, the better it's going to be for you. Now, obviously, this is all stuff you don't have to worry about working inside of a studio. You generally have an IT department. And I know for myself personally, my computer hardware skills really atrophied. Basically all problems that I had, I would enter an IT ticket and walk away till somebody fixed it, which is fantastic, but it's also a hindrance when it comes time to having to do it yourself. So yeah, you're gonna have to brush up those skills a little bit once you go freelancing. And that'll do it for this part. If I can think of enough other topics and issues, I'll make a part 3 to this video, but I think it's time we tackle some different questions. Thanks for watching.